All right, it's Coach Q. Welcome back to another episode of The Ride. Today's conversation is with Zach Capozzi from Lax Reference. And Zach actually is one of the first returning guests on the channel after we talked with him in 2024 and got some great feedback from people that listened to the show. So happy to have him back. Now, the topics today were really a continuation of that discussion we had with Zach in 2024, which is how best coaches can use data and analytics to help improve their teams, how NPI was used for the first time in 2025 and his thoughts on that whole process and really where we're headed as a sport when it comes to looking at data and analytics and how to apply it to lacrosse. So as always, hopefully you find some value in it and enjoy the ride. All right, Zach, welcome back to the ride, back by popular demand. I've always wanted to say that here on the show, but good to see you, man. I can't even remember when our last interview was, but I'm excited to have you back. It's going to be a great conversation. Lacrosse data, analytics, all of this stuff that we kind of nerd out over. I'm excited to have that convo. How you doing, man?
Glad to be back. It's always fun to have the two Zachs on the podcast. So,
Zach and Zach, that sounds like a Disney Channel series or something like that. What have you been up to in that time, man? First of all, what was the month? Was it in 2024?
It was either December or last January, but I think it was before the season.
Yeah, so literally a year it's been. So what have you been up to in that time?
Yeah, I mean, lots of building new stuff. I mean, that's the day in the life of Lacrosse Reference is usually building some kind of new metric or making the existing metrics work better, or building features or that sort of thing. So, just building new stuff.
What would you say in the last year has been kind of the biggest product update or where your focus has been on more when it comes to improving the product from 2024 to 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, when I think of, obviously there's two different constituencies, right? So from a fan perspective, I mean, NPI last year in D3 was a blast for me because you've got finally this, automatic selection process for the NCAA tournament. So, building out the simulations to be able to say things like, if Team A, wins their last three but loses their first conference tournament game, here's the percentage chance that they'll have an NPI that puts them into the field. I mean, that was just a really cool intersection of like, it's the stakes were there because now all of a sudden this is actually how they're picking teams. And also I just, the simulation models that I've built over time were just perfect for that kind of thing. So building out those features and giving people that like, if this, then that type view of how the conference tournaments were going to impact who ultimately got in was a lot of fun.
From someone who doesn't have much information on kind of how that selection process goes or the ranking systems, what does NPI stand for? How did it get implemented? Oh, yeah. Give me just a quick little tidbit.
It's like a power index, so it's kind of like RPI, but not really, right? So I think it means like net performance index or something like that. Honestly, I don't even know what it stands for, but I think that's what it was. And you can think of this is a type of model like a strength of record model. So basically it's taking everybody's wins and giving them a point value based on who the win was against, and everybody's losses and kind of deducting points based on who they lost to. And so, you could have a team with the same NPI who was undefeated. Another team could be barely over 500, but if the schedules were such that barely 500 record was actually as impressive as the undefeated record, they could have the same NPI. So it's that way of saying how good were your wins, how bad were your losses, and that gets every team a score. And so they literally just went down the list and said, okay, any team that didn't have an outlaw or didn't have an AQ, we just line them up by NPI, and the best NPIs got in and the worst NPIs got left out. So and it was fully automated, right? This was the first time that there was no committee, there was no debate. It was just if your NPI was high enough, you were in. If it wasn't, you were out.
Wow. This is a fascinating discussion because you see this a little bit on the college football side right now where they moved to the 12-team playoff. Are you following that at all? Tell me a little bit about your thoughts here. Let's have a data kind of like lens to it, but also just your thoughts on all the chaos that is right now the college football playoff. And
I mean, I think, and we in D1 we have the same process, right? We have a bunch of people that get in a room, they debate and they say here's who's in, and so I think the contrast from D1 to D3 lacrosse is really interesting because now there's no debate. And I think what's interesting about when there's people in a room, right, they have all these metrics, but you don't really know if they're using the metrics or if they're just kind of going on vibes and then they're saying, well, here's the metrics that support what we had to say. And so, strength of record is one of the metrics that, I know ESPN puts it out for college football on their FPI ratings. And I know it's a metric that the committee has mentioned, whether it's that one or a different algorithm for strength of record, but it's something they've mentioned using. And so, but then again, then they'll talk about these teams and they'll say, well, and this is why we had this team in front of this team. And you're kind of like looking at the numbers, like that doesn't really make any sense based on what you said you were using. And I think we see that in lacrosse a little bit too, right? In lacrosse, in D1, they've always used the RPI tiers, right? So, oh, wow, you beat a top 5 RPI team. That's really good. Oh, you beat a 5 through 10 RPI team. That's pretty good. Oh, you had 4 wins against the top 20 RPI teams. That's okay. And so they use those sort of tiers. And it's sort of like a strength of record system in a way. Except, the weird thing in college lacrosse is like if you beat the number 21 RPI team, it's like it never happened, right? That's like, they basically say, well, we don't really give any credit for games outside the top 20. And so, strength of record is one of the things I like about it is it doesn't have those arbitrary cutoffs, right? Like in a strength of record system, you get slightly less credit for beating the number 21 team than you do the number 20 team, as it should be, right? There's really why is there such a hard cutoff there? And so, but you see in college football, they have similar things, right? Okay, we've got this top 25 cutoff. And if you've beat teams in the CFP rankings, right, that's good. If you haven't, that's
but
bad.
if you beat the 26th team, it doesn't really show up. Yeah, that's interesting.
So that's one of the things that I think true strength of record models do a really good job of is they don't have that arbitrary cutoff where, based on various things, a game either is really important or all of a sudden it doesn't matter at all. And so I think that's one thing where NPI was really helpful because now you've got a way to kind of value all those wins and all those losses. And, I always talk about that in D1, right? With some of the Patriot League teams, they're always going to have a lot of games played against teams that are sort of 20 to 30 in the RPI. And in our system, right, they don't really get any credit for that. And, with the strength of record, you would have a better way to kind of calculate or at least assign credit for those victories. Now, NPI kind of goes a little bit too far, I think, in that like the credit you get for beating the number 16 team in the country is not quite is not that much less than beating like the number 2 team in the country, just based on the way that algorithm works. So it's it is an SOR system. It is very cool. It's not perfect, but I think it's an improvement on the tiers that we use in other places.
I'm interested in your thoughts on kind of the scheduling process for college coaches. You're looking at the data all the time. It's interesting to me thinking about what you just mentioned where kind of the teams within conference are almost interconnected at that point. You often see like coaches would just focused on our team, right? But when you have a team or a couple teams that are maybe having a bad year, that can go out and affect your placing or even getting seeded in the NCAA tournament. That's a really fascinating discussion for me. Give me your thoughts on like what college coaches, based on what the NPI is doing now at all levels, right? Is this being done at D2 and D3 yet?
So D3 last year, as I understand it, it's going to roll out to D2. I think not. I don't think it's this year, but at some point soon they'll be using it as well. Is the way I've read it. No necessarily any momentum on D1. I don't think there's a plan to use NPI in the D1 world at all. But it's certainly a topic that's come up in D1, and there's some people would like to use a system like this. But yeah, just D3 for sure, D2 in the next couple of years, and we'll see in the future on D1.
What is the metric they're using now at D1? I thought we were talking about that.
There is an RPI. They use the RPI system, and that gives every team a rating. It's just that it's not the selection process, right? Whereas in D3, like that is whether you get in or not. Whereas in D1, it's a metric that they use, and it's what they use to kind of, do their debate. But ultimately, there's no criteria that they use any metric to pick the teams.
So the Division I still has the committee.
That's right.
Piece. Okay, I appreciate you keeping me up to date on all this stuff. You can tell I'm not as locked in as you are on that front. Yeah, I'm interested here. I do want to talk a little bit about the crossover that we're seeing with the playoff. It's interesting to me that you see a lot of, with all the chaos that you see in football, you see teams already rescheduling for the coming years. Like they're already taking some harder teams off the schedule So as far as like what college coaches will be doing to their schedules based on what we're talking about here, what do you predict kind of having, or what would be the optimal thing that coaches should be doing based on this conversation we're having?
I mean, in D1, it's pretty well known, right? Your RPI really takes a hit if you beat a team that's in a really low conference. So that's a well-known one. I think with NPI, right, it's actually kind of funny because I spent quite a bit of time over the offseason trying to game that out and say, okay, given a team's schedule, given what their rating is as a sort of program strength, like what are the teams that you should schedule next year to increase your chances of getting an NCAA tournament bid? And honestly, like it's an open question. I couldn't really find a good way to say, yes, this is the team you should schedule and this is the team you should avoid. And I think really what it comes down to is that because NPI is a strength of record system, it does do a pretty good job of balancing the sort of the risk and reward, right? So like you could go and build a really easy schedule and, attempt to go undefeated. And if you go undefeated, there's a very good chance you'll get in. Obviously, your margin for error then is very, very low, right? If you lose any of those games, you're out. You could go the other direction, say we're going to schedule a bunch of really hard teams, and then as long as we can get one or two of them, we've got a really good shot to get in. Now, are you going to be able to beat one or two of those really good teams on your schedule? And so I never really found like a really obvious like this is the right way to schedule under NPI. Which is not exactly what I was expecting. And again, I mean, I think there's also the uncertainty too, like you said, of you just don't know if a team's going to be good next year, right? And if they lose 2 games that they won last year, that could really have a negative effect on your NPI from having them on the schedule. So I think there's just too much uncertainty, and the system is not really set up where you can game it necessarily, which I think is a good thing, right? I mean, give coaches the ability to schedule whoever they want. Just know that you're either if you have a lesser schedule, you're going to have to win all those games. I do think, and one of the coaches I talked to about this raised the point, there is the open question of like, okay, if you've got 16 games on your schedule and should you add another game, right? Or should you drop a game? And I think that's a little bit more of a team specific thing, just on philosophy, like travel needs, all that sort of stuff. But I do think that might be an area where ultimately you can make yes, if you're going to schedule a game, here's who you might want to add, versus like if it's a question of replacing teams, then that's a little bit trickier. But again, I don't think there's a really clear cut, this is who you should schedule, or here's the right way to schedule under NPI, just because it's a strength of record system and you're going to get credit for beating the teams you beat and penalized for the teams you lost to. And if you lose to bad teams, you're going to have a really hard time getting in. And so it's a trade-off. And I think ultimately it's like a slider, right? Do you want to have margin for error, or do you want to have, no margin for error and a much better schedule? But ultimately your chance of getting in are really more dependent on how good you are and how well you do in those games.
Metaphorical gun to the head situation here. Which one are you picking though? Are you picking the easy schedule, or are you picking the tough schedule?
Oh man. I mean, as a fan, tough schedule. Like I always want to see those good games. And ultimately I do think like, it depends. I mean, if you're a program and you think we're on the rise, right? Maybe we do say, hey, yes, let's go with,
sneak one.
Right. There's a benefit to us in having a strong record and showing progress. If you're a team that's truly thinking about winning a national championship, you probably do get a benefit from scheduling more difficult teams. And, maybe you're willing to have that extra risk because you're going to get the benefit from it. So it's probably, as a fan, I'd love to see all those great games. And I do think if you're a team that's got designs on really advancing far in the tournament, you want to challenge yourself so you know where your strengths and weaknesses are.
Well, I think that's a reckoning that's going to have to be had at the college football level. And, to the lacrosse point as well, when you're talking about these late stage tournaments where you don't want to see early season big matches be taken away. These big out of conference games, they're great for fans. When you see High Point play Duke, for example, like that's a great early season game. It's been a little bit of a bugaboo for Duke, but I love that from a fan perspective, seeing like hardcore out of conference games. And you see that now with college football where they're actually taking that off the schedule, which the pendulum needs to swing back, hopefully, towards the fan experience.
Well, and I think there's also, the committee has a big role to play in this too. And I think the lacrosse committee, the way that they've made those top 5 RPI wins really important in the top 10 and, wins against the top 20 RPI teams. It's going to be tougher for a team. I mean, if you're a team in the Big Ten, ACC, Ivy League, and you play nobody in out of conference, and you don't, and you go 3-3 in your league, you're not going to get in. So I think the way that the lacrosse committee has done it probably does lead more towards like those games are important. And I think the in football, like we'll see how they end up going this direction, because I think the thing, since it's so much of just this subjectiveness about how these people do it, next year it could be different, right? There's no guarantee that the next committee is not going to really focus on who did you beat in the top 10. And so I think there's a little bit of a risk of going the other direction and saying we're going to schedule easy and we're going to end up 10-2, because if enough other teams still have those games where they end up with a better strength of record than you, then you could easily be out. And again, it goes back to, if you load up on easy teams, you better be sure you're going to beat all of them, and that's not a guarantee. I mean, you can look at probabilities, and if you've got a 90% chance to win these games, like the chance of you going undefeated is still not very high. And so it's that risk reward trade off, and certainly if you know that the committee is going to go a certain direction and they're going to really penalize teams for losses against good teams, sure, you might go a different direction then, but nobody knows that ahead of time, and so I think that's always where it's tricky.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating conversation, because I'm thinking about it in real time, and it's almost like maybe this is a controversial take, that you want to see controversy with the selection process because that draws eyes, right? Like when you think about last year, and I know we talked pre-episode that you put 2025 in the rearview mirror and we're moving on to 26, so we don't really have too much conversation today on that, but Army was a big talking piece about whether they would get in and whether they get on. And when you talk about drawing eyes and drawing just interest in something, controversy does a great job of that. And so maybe you don't want this smooth process where it's like, oh, everybody who we thought would get in got in and that's it, because then people aren't getting riled up and talking about the sport. I know this is kind of a 30,000 foot view, but take me a little bit through that Army piece, because that was the most controversial from the D1 side of things, committee wise.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's kind of interesting with NPI and even with the strength of record, and because lacrosse, I mean, you can still model it out, and they're not so far off. It's not like they're going crazy, going rogue every year. So you still have a pretty good sense of, if this happens, then this team's going to get in. And it was interesting with Army because like their situation was, they had, I think I have all my memories correct from last year, but it was kind of Harvard versus Army, right? That's who ended up being the last spot. And Harvard had beat Syracuse and Army had beat UNC. And so it was actually kind of this like proxy battle in the last couple weeks of the season, because for Army, every time UNC won, it really boosted the value of that victory, right? And for Harvard, every time Syracuse won, it really boosted the value of that victory. And I think if I was looking back at my notes before we got on here, and Army, I thought they had a pretty good shot. We were about two weeks out, and it was looking like, if they had lost in the Patriot League tournament, they still could have easily had an at-large worthy resume. But then Carolina kind of like, I don't want to say tanked down the stretch, but like they really didn't. They struggled in the ACC tournament. I think they lost their last game to Duke, or whatever it was. They didn't necessarily close very strong heading into the NCAA tournament. And then Syracuse goes on this bender, and they won the ACC tournament. They beat all these teams at the end of the year. So like, it was kind of one of those things that like, if you're sitting there at the middle of April, you'd say, hey, Army's won these games. They've got a great win against UNC. Depending on how things shake out, they're actually sitting pretty well, even if they had lost that Patriot League game. But then sort of like all the things that Army didn't want to have happen, Syracuse goes on a run. UNC loses a couple games. So at the end of the day, like
Duke and Richmond,
right. So at the end of the day, like Harvard did have kind of, I think, a superior resume. So I don't think it was a huge surprise that they were the team that got in. If those things had gone the other direction and Army had still lost that Patriot League game, I think it easily could have ended up that they would have put Army in, because you look at a situation where instead of Syracuse being, I think they ended up in the top 5 for RPI, maybe they end up 15, right? And maybe Carolina ends up at 4, and now those two resumes look very different. So I think it was one of those things that like I always do root for like, hey, I'd love to see a really tight decision, that sort of forces us to know what the committee valued. We didn't really get it last year because of the way that things ended, specifically with Syracuse and UNC. But I think it was. I think there's a lot of people that Army can never get in as an at-large team if they don't win their conference, and I don't think that's true because last year they easily could have, and things just didn't work out. In some of those other games that they would have needed to go a different direction.
This is just coming back to me. So I'm kind of in your boat where I'm like, I want to talk 2025, but it seems so long ago. But Yale is a great example of a team where they had it on their schedule. They're like, hell yeah, this is going to be a great out-of-conference win, and it didn't end up serving them. Super interesting, man. Any like data points or things you've learned from that 2025 season going into 26? Just like any outliers or maybe from the Division II, Division III level. I know you said you're focused on 26, but any other recap stuff from 25 that kind of ring a bell for you?
I mean, it was pretty cool watching, in D3, seeing Dickinson go as far as they went to the title game. So I think it's one of those things too. Like for me, NPI was such a cool thing that it really got me kind of more into D3 lacrosse than I've ever been in my life. And so it was fun watching some of these like streams of these D3 games and watching Dickinson kind of roll through the tournament. That was a blast. I think you think of a team like Lafayette was one that made some strides in the D1 side as well that, you think about maybe can take another step this year. And then, I certainly think like Stanford was one that, when the women's bracket came out, it was kind of like, that's an interesting seeding. There were some teams that ended up with some home games that you look at Stanford's resume and efficiency numbers and think maybe they got snubbed a little bit. So it's always, I think at this point you do think about those things as how do they roll into the next year? Do those teams continue kind of the climb, or does Stanford use that as fuel for the fire to kind of take another step in the ACC? I think Lafayette's always an interesting one because for a while, we think about. I mean, I guess it's been a while since Loyola was really up there, so it's been BU and Army in the Patriot League, and Colgate kind of took a step last year, and it'd be cool to see, the way that conference kind of cannibalizes itself. Maybe Lafayette's a team that jumps up and makes some noise this year too. So, it's definitely some. I mean, there's always good stories throughout all of college lacrosse, and those ones stood out a little bit, mostly in terms of are they going to be able to make the next step this year?
Yeah, on that Stanford piece, it's interesting, man, especially at the D3 level, that geolocation spot or just the geography being based on the seeding has to hurt your soul because that literally has nothing to do with the play on the field or the data or anything like that. It's literally like, oh, well, this school's closer to this school. It's sad. Okay, let's move into a little bit of the 2026 season. Before we do that, though, you did mention, talking to a coach and having the conversation around like, should you schedule easier? Should you schedule harder? For those people that don't know what you're doing at Lax Reference, that sounds like a consultation product, honestly. But I'd love to know exactly like what you're doing with these coaches, just so that people can get the word of whether they would love to use the product, at a deeper level. Yeah. Because I use it on the daily from when I'm in season to just keep up with the college efficiency numbers and all that. But what other stuff do you offer for people out there?
Yeah, I mean, and this conversation was one that wasn't even with one of the teams that's a customer of the product. I just, I love having these conversations and talking stats and talking shop. And honestly, it gives me a lot of benefit to kind of hear what coaches are questioning and what their questions are. And I had a conversation with a high school coach who had a bunch of stats, and we were just talking through how you might use those to kind of, be smarter about practice time and that sort of stuff. So I have a lot of conversations that are not as part of the actual product, but I mean, the pro site for teams has really evolved. Initially, it was like, I have a lot of cool stats. Would you like to see them? And over the years, as I've had, working with these teams and understanding kind of really what they need, it's been cool to kind of evolve it a bit. So like, even just things as simple as like, before when your game ends, right, you've got an email with sort of the Lacrosse Reference view of your next opponent. And just ways to kind of, I would say like kind of get your scouting off to a strong start for your next opponent. And, there's a lot of like off-season reports as well that just say, hey, going through of the teams that are in your spot in terms of efficiency, like the ones that improve next year, how did they do it? And so I think that's a lot of the way the product has evolved from just here's the data, here's the stats, here's the reports, to more of like, what is it that they need to know when they need to know it to be, more effective in whatever they're trying to do. And like a good example, this year I've kind of thought a lot about the idea of going kind of the why of stuff, right? So, one of the things that one of my coaches suggested a couple years ago is like, I've always split up like performance within the shot clock, right? So for a team, what's their shooting percentage in the first 20 versus the next 20 versus the next 20? So you end up with these 4 different buckets. And one of my coaches said, I could really use that at a player level. And so like that idea has kind of evolved now where you've got this idea of, okay, yes, the player's in the 30th percentile from overall efficiency. And then you want to ask the question, okay, why is that? And now we can say, okay, well, we've always been able to say, well, their shooting efficiency is in the 20th percentile. And now kind of digging down another layer lower and say, okay, well, why is their shooting efficiency in the 20th percentile? And now you can start to look at like, oh, wow, when you look at their charts, like, their shooting percentage in the first 20 seconds of the shot clock is terrible. They're actually fine everywhere else. So how do we kind of coach that player in those situations to be more maybe discerning in shot selection or whatever it is, right? So it's that idea of sort of trying to get to that lowest level and say, whatever you're trying to solve as a program at that moment, what's the data that's going to help you make that decision? Not the data that's going to tell you what the decision should be, but if you're having that conversation of like, I know I've got more that I can get out of this player, looking at the numbers and saying, okay, here's where they're strong, here's where they're weak, what can I do about it? It is really where we're trying to kind of move this thing so that it's, again, what data do you need at the time you need it to help you do whatever it is you're trying to do?
I want to have this conversation around the Lax GPT product. So I'm going to be your biggest salesman here too, because that seems to me, one, great branding, and two, just a useful tool. Because what you just talked about, where you're saying, well, like, let's look at this efficiency data, and then looking at that data and going 4 levels below that is just something that, if you're not attuned to that stuff, is going to be hard to even find the avenue, right, of which door you need to open to get to that next thing to eventually find that golden nugget of information. I did a little bit of work with ChatGPT this past season, and you're going to love this. I just typed all of I know that's not automated, so you probably won't love it as much, but I just input the data from a team that we were going to play in the championship game. We played them once before, so I was looking at that stuff, and I fed it to ChatGPT, and I listened to the feedback a little bit and saw what it gave me. It's not great just because it doesn't have that full understanding. It's context, all that stuff. But I tried. But it sounds like this Lax GPT stuff can work within your product potentially, where if a coach is looking at wanting some answers, it can just maybe ask the Lax GPT.
Well, it's funny because so right now, I think I'm always really nervous about something like this and opening it up, and because you just never know what you're going to get out of it, and the worry is always that you give somebody data without the context for them to use it. And I think that's one of the things that, ultimately, what's really cool is if I have a question from somebody, this system that I've put together, it knows my databases, it knows how all these things fit together, it knows how they're calculated. And so it can go through and it can kind of answer the question and say, okay, I've created a Python script that's going to run against your data and spit out the number that you've requested, right? So that part is kind of, that's what these things are great at, is taking context and using it to write some code and give you an answer. So I think there's kind of 2 types of tasks there, right? That's a sort of cut and dry, stuff about how many goals did this player score, in their career, or who has the most X and Y this season? What teams are there? Any teams that have 3 players that have scored 20 points, right? That stuff's really kind of path 1 that's sort of easy, but then you've got this other path that's I am struggling to figure out how to get this player to be more effective, right? And I think ultimately that's where the real value in this sort of stuff is. And right now, send me an email and we'll have a conversation about it. I'll look at my data and I'll interpret it for you. That's I think the way that we're doing things right now. But ultimately, right, that doesn't scale. If there's a point in where it's 900 NCAA teams are using pro, right, there's no way that I can have those conversations individually. So, when you think about Lax GPT, it's sort of melding that. What's the data that's going to help you answer that question? And then how can we train the system to interpret that data the same way I would, so that instead of having to give a coach data and charts, you're just giving them the insight that they can then go and use. And it's, that's the one where it's like it's hard right now to imagine that these systems will be able to do that. But like every time I test them and every time I try it, like it's actually getting better and better and better. I think the challenging part is like you have to give it that context of, okay, when I see this chart and I see this number in the context of a certain player, this is how I am interpreting it, right? And you can kind of build some rules in that says that like it doesn't have to be this player's name, but if you say, okay, this player's in the 20th percentile for shooting efficiency, they've taken between 50 and 20% of their team's shots, and they have an assist rate that's below average, right? Now that's a bunch of different players that you would all kind of interpret their numbers all kind of in the same way. And so I think that's the missing middle piece, is saying, when I look at someone like this to answer a question like this, how do I interpret it? And if you can train these large language model systems to take the data, take that context, and understand the question and respond as I would, then you've got something that does scale, which is potentially pretty cool. So, it's one of those things that right now I would say that, people can ask me questions, I'll have a conversation, we'll answer them. But over time, as if I'm getting to the point where I'm getting too many questions and don't have time to have all these conversations, then hopefully by then the system is trained that it can give a first pass that's going to be as good as if you were sitting down with me.
Yeah. I guess my first response to this, although my mind is going in like 1,000 different directions, and I love these conversations with you, man, is like that should be a product you should charge for, like consulting. I know that you're getting feedback from the coaches, and that's good, but the insights you can get from talking with someone like you that understands the data is valuable. And so, we can definitely talk offline about that too. I'm just super fascinated. But one of the reasons why you're one of my first returning guests is that you're doing something that nobody else is doing, right? It's almost like the Wild West. And I look at and maybe Wild West isn't the greatest analogy. You're kind of like that first person that got to like Wyoming and you're kind of setting up shop, you know what I mean? And like eventually people will get there. But one of the things that's really cool is being able to look at other sports, right? Because they have had that journey. And so you're setting up this thing that, the infrastructure for something that already exists in another sport. What do you take? Like what lessons do you take from basketball, specifically probably basketball, but I'd love your insights on any other sports you use. What insights are you taking from how they've built their infrastructure over time and how that can translate to lacrosse?
Yeah. I mean, I think inspiration is really there in basketball. Like the amount of stuff they've done with spatial data around saying like, here's how far the closest defender was from a shooter, and sort of bucketing, shooting percentage based on that. I think is a great example that like spacing and where players are on the field is really important in basketball, and it's really important in lacrosse too. And so I think that's an area that would be it's difficult to do, right? And like Spectrum, and Sport View and all these systems that they've got 100 cameras in the rafters of these NBA arenas. There's a big technical and financial leap to get there in lacrosse, but I think it does point the way forward that like, once you have a good sense of like, shooting efficiencies and all the things that we can glean from box score data, I do think that the spatial stuff is kind of a next evolution there, to understand, because I think it'd be fascinating if you had 100 possessions on video and you could feed it into a model and kind of quantify what the spacing looked like as they sort of initiated their action to goal, and start to understand, like, because the same way that you say, oh, your shooting percentage in the first 20 seconds of the shot clock is great, in the last 20 seconds of the shot clock it's terrible, right? Okay, well, now I can have a different conversation about, okay, well, let's focus on what happens in those last 20 seconds of the shot clock. I think it's similar here, that if if you're a defense and you've given up 30 goals and you can see that, wow, on 29 of those goals, something happened sort of in the way that the players were moving around the field or the way that your defenders were interacting with each other. And now we say, oh, well, I mean, when that happens, we give up a goal. Like that's a pretty clear, thing. And now, obviously, if you're giving a goal 29 out of 30 times, like I suspect your coaching staff probably already knows what that thing is. I think it's more in those more subtle situations where maybe 60% of the goals you allow are caused by some sort of like spatial breakdown or something. Now we've got a really specific thing that we can coach against and say, okay, it's and it goes the why question, right? Why did we lose? Well, we gave up 15 goals. Why did we give up 15 goals? And if you don't have a good answer to that question, sometimes the spatial stuff can be the answer. Oh, wow, okay, we get 15 goals, and on 13 of them, this thing happened. Well, okay, how do we prevent that thing from happening? Right, is the next question. So that's I
Yeah.
not automated in any way in lacrosse. Probably years from being able to do it in an automated way. But I think that's the sort of stuff that for staffs that can figure out a way to collect that data, there's a lot of upside.
Yeah. I mean, you say, decades, but I really think with the advent of like more sophisticated AI and the way that I've seen a lot of recording companies, I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but like companies that create these tools, like Huddle has their camera, obviously, but there's going to be more companies that go more in depth. I don't think it's that far off when you think about, some of these larger programs that have a ton of money. They could have a video set up where you could train AI to look at certain things, but I'm over my skis on that a little bit.
And I think ultimately, like, these things are not. This is the class of things where like you could spin up a system to scan video and identify players in 5 minutes, right? It's not hard to build, but like that model will be 70% accurate, right? It'll say yes, the shot came from this location, and it'll be right 70% of the time. And then you could invest a couple weeks, and you probably get the model to 85% accuracy. And now you've got a okay system, but like for this kind of thing, I always worry about 85% accuracy being really good. And the problem in my experience with stuff like this type of problem that you're trying to solve, you can get to 95% in a couple months, and you will never get to 100%. Like you just without like 50 cameras around the NBA arena and hordes of armies of people working on it, like it's just very hard to get something that you can feel confident with. And I've talked to coaches about like shot charting, and a lot of them have said, well, we just don't use it because like I don't know who tagged those shots, and I don't know if they're accurate, and if I don't know they're accurate, can't use it. And so I think this kind of falls in that same class of things where it's like, unless I can tell you that it's 99% or good enough for you to draw conclusions from, I always worry that it's just not going to be worth the effort to build.
Shout out to the SID directors everywhere doing a job that's usually volunteer based, and sometimes, especially at the high school level, you think about trying to get accurate data. That if you can't start there, you're going to have a tough time getting to what we just talked about. But I'm interested in like how we collect some better data. Maybe that's more usable now. Maybe just a more direct that coaches can do. I know we're talking about a lot of things that might exist in 5 to 10 years, but like what can coaches be doing other than getting that box score right now, even if it's not that scalable, just something they can pick from this conversation?
I think like if you could shot chart yourself, and I think that's one. Like I've got several teams that use a version of Pro that includes shot charting, and they'll tag shots and do things like it was a up the alley shot, right-handed versus left-handed, stuff that's not in the box score, but they can pull it off film. And for me, it's just provide them the tools so that they can do this easily, and then get to a report that says, okay, for all your shooters, here's their shooting percentage on up the alley shots, for example. And so, I think it's like what I would love to have teams do is say, hey, we get students coming to us all the time who want to do analytics and they want to help our program. I would love for them to, get a pro subscription and send those kids to me, and, I can teach them to use those tools, because ultimately, it's not that it's hard to do manually. It's just like you don't necessarily have the tools. And if you're just staring at an Excel spreadsheet and you want to do shot charting, like there's nothing you can do about it. But if you've got the tools that you can do that charting and tagging and that sort of thing, and you've taught somebody how you want them to do it, I do think that if you can make that investment of sort of upfront time, there's a lot of benefit from it. And I've got some of my teams are even charting their practice film, right? And they'll chart practice film and have for their individual players, and especially the players that don't see the field a lot during games. Now you've got that sort of information which can help you build a plan with that player to help them get better. And so I don't think it is a question of like, for me to build it in a way that it could work for everybody, very, very difficult. For me to build tools that will allow any team who's willing to put in the effort to get a lot of value out of that sort of spatial based data, that's doable. Yeah. And I think that's the way that I've tried to focus on it, because it's never going to be, hey, send me your film and here's all the perfect data. But if you've got film and you've got the time and the resources to tag stuff, then I want to make sure that the output is going to help you do something, right? That's the way I've kind of approached it.
Yeah. Well, I like that white glove service like first, right? Being able to kind of go program by program or people that are interested in it. Yeah, but I'd love to see it get scaled out too. What are some of the conversations you're having with other high school coaches? I know you mentioned talking to, a few coaches via email. What are some other like conversations of what coaches are looking for from data or just insights into that? I love what you're talking about with spacing, because when you talk about being a defensive coach, you're talking about where are certain players on the field when a goal is scored, or where are a majority of their goals being scored from. That type of data could really be helpful, but that's something I have to do manually, obviously. What are some insights from other coaches that you have?
Shout out to Mitchell up at University of Ottawa. He reached out and we had a conversation over the summer that was pretty cool. And it was a good mix of sort of the technology enabling something that otherwise would be difficult to do. And his question was around like they call it like these fire calls, right? If there's a slide that needs to happen and the goalie's supposed to initiate it and somebody's supposed to slide and somebody's supposed to recover. And so what we talked about was like, building out a system that, because the idea was like, I was playing around with some of the models and how they can glean data from like a piece of paper. So you can imagine like you would do tallies or something and, you can feed this to a model and it can spit out the data that was recorded. And so it was the same kind of conversation that we had of like, what if there was a template that every time there was a situation that should have resulted in a fire call, you've got somebody with a clipboard who's saying, yes, no, yes, right? The first thing happened or it didn't happen. The second thing happened or it didn't happen. And maybe even like who was the player that was supposed to slide and did they? And so you can imagine that idea of like, if you've got an injured player with a clipboard and they know what they're supposed to be doing, or even you're yelling out the data to them that you saw, and now you've got this piece of paper with the 15 fire calls from your practice or your game, you send that in to the model, it spits out the data, and you've got this running tally of, are we getting better?
It's like slide efficiency.
Are we getting better at sliding, essentially? And if not, are there players that are struggling with sliding or parts of parts of that process? And so, I think there was another coach I talked to that was really interested in like introducing more competition into practice. And there's systems out there that are Excel based that require a lot of like data input. And so it's kind of a similar idea of like, if you have a game that you want to play and you have a clipboard and you can record what happened. I think of like, head to head draw, whatever this thing is. If there's a head to head component or team versus team component, and you can just record on a piece of paper like what happened and then turn that into actual data without having to go through the process of actually typing it in after practice. I feel like that could be an unlock for some things. Just in terms of like, if we want to have a competitive practice, like there's ways to do it. And I think it would be awesome. Like if you had throughout the course of a season, if there's a skill that you really want your team to focus on and you can figure out how to make it a game that you can then keep track of throughout the season, now there's stakes. Now players care. What would have just been a boring drill is now like a really fun competition. I think there's some unlocks there that could be really interesting. And again, I think that's a place where like some of the AI technologies that can allow you to take a piece of paper with scrawled notes on it and turn it into actual real data that can feed into some sort of like scoring model that gives you a standings leaderboard, that you can go and like refer to at the end of practice. Like, I mean, I've never coached, but as a player, I think that'd be a blast.
It was just interesting interacting with ChatGPT when I was telling you about the team we were playing against the championship. I was literally typing in, like, I watched a couple games, one against ours and a couple more games to try to get more data. And I was literally like, number 2, sweeping left for the goal. Like I would type where it's going because it obviously can't see anything. But there's all these intricacies that I'm super fascinated with. Another thing that got me thinking when you were talking about having the player be able to write down, maybe have a template that you could work with over the course of a season with ChatGPT or Lax GPT or what have you. I always am like interested when they pan to the coaching box in the NFL and there's 2 rows of 5 coaches and they're all writing something down. I wonder if that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
Like you're always like, what are they? What are you writing down? All 10 of you are writing down something. Obviously, they have a responsibility of what they're looking at on the field or what player. But I wonder if that isn't data that they can look at something at halftime, like you're saying, where, it's not sliding. It's not whether Johnny or, Paul slid. Yeah. It's whether they didn't hit that gap or.
I mean, I think if it were me, it'd be that kind of stuff exactly. It's like we were talked about, like, you give up a goal and there's 4 failure modes that lead to a goal. Okay, every time we give up a goal, we need to record which one it was. And now we've got an extra data set that's going to really help us understand what happened. And yeah, I mean, I also do not know what they're writing, but like, it seems to me like that's like, did that play work or did it not work, and why? It seems like the kind of thing that you'd really get a lot of value out of recording. And again, I think that's where like some of the AI tools make it like that's not, they have 10 people sitting there doing that who they pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. When you're a D3 staff with 2 people, there's no way you'd be able to collect all that data and then do something with it. I think what some of the promise of these tools is like, if you can collect the data, we can figure out how to make it useful. To either give you a weight, this is the drill we need to do in practice, or just this is the player that needs to do X, Y, Z, whatever the situation is. But I mean, that kind of goes like a lot of times the question I get from coaches is like, what's the golden metric that I need to win? And I'm like, well, it's score more goals, allow less goals. Like, okay, but then it's always like, well, how, right? And I think that's where now we can start to understand more of the how. Because if you say, hey, I've got this play that works 75% of the time, and 25% of the time it doesn't work. If you can start to say, okay, we just ran it, it didn't work, here's why. We just ran it, it didn't work, here's why. Now we have that information that you can actually do something with. Because if I just tell you, well, you need to score more goals and allow less goals, like, okay, well, how the heck am I supposed to do that? You got to get to that lower level to be able to do anything about it.
The way that I look at it, it's based on, conversations I've had with you. This data is all about the why. It's about getting down to why things are happening. And it's not oftentimes like something you could be doing extra. It's looking at things you're already doing and trying to kind of scale back that as well, as opposed to like trying to find this untangible thing of why you're losing. It's looking in between the lines of what you're already doing. Any other data point or I know we talked about like potentially slide efficiency is one on defense. You talked one, I believe, on offense in areas that they're shooting from. Is there any other potential data point that we're missing out on? Whether coaches can track it or not at all these levels is a whole nother question. But what is something else that you'd love to see tracked on offense for Lacrosse?
Yeah, well, I mean, it would be cool to have substitution data. People always ask me about plus minus, and you can't do it because you don't know who was on the field at a given time. So that's definitely one that could be interesting to play around with. I do think like, it is tracked in a way, but like just the idea of like whether a shot was saved or missed off cage is a really important data point that we just totally gloss over. We just look at shooting. Most people just look at shooting percentage and ignore whether those shots were saves or not. And I just think that's one of the most important ones, because like if you could have 2 players with the same shooting percentage, but one of them can be a huge drag on your offense if all those misses are saved, because now they're going the other direction in transition and your defense has to scramble, versus a player whose misses are off cage. That's a very different profile in terms of how efficient that player is on offense. And it's one of those things that it's just like, it drives me nuts when we cite goals per game, because goals per game is so affected by how many possessions you have. And similarly, like shooting percentage is, it's a stat that, is just misleading in some cases if you've got that big swing between, players that put a ton of shots on cage and players that don't, right? I don't care what your shot on goal rate is. All I really care about is on the shots you put on cage, like how often did they go in? And I just don't want to say don't care about it at all. Like it does make a difference, but it's context that I think we ignore when we just look at shooting percentages.
What could you name that data set?
I mean, I have a metric that's just on goal shooting percentage, right? Which is just goals divided by shots on goal. I mean, it is exactly what it calculates, right? And I think that to me kind of feeds into the shooting efficiency calculation, that overall, like we care about how much value you produce per shot. We don't necessarily care as much about like what percentage of your goals went in or shots went in, because again, that that treats all misses the same, which is crazy. So to me, shooting efficiency is the one that I really, if I, when I always use percentiles. So if I'm citing someone shooting, it's always going to be what's their shooting efficiency percentile as opposed to their shooting percentage percentile, which again is just, it obscures too much.
Yeah, one of my most recent guests was Paul Richards, the defensive coordinator at Richmond. And I never got to ask him this. We kind of like went into other ways of conversation, but I wanted to ask, their goals per game is insane some of the times. I mean, they're perennially at the top of that defensive efficiency list. And I'm like, how much is it pace of play and your clearing that leads to that? As opposed, I mean, I know you guys are great at defense. I just wonder if there's like a cultural thing within Richmond that's we just clear way better or our pace of play is way slower. So I could probably find that data on your site, by the way, now that I'm saying it out loud. But yeah, that was interesting. And then the only other piece that from that convo that I'm interested in your thoughts on, where at the end of the conversation, I'm like, Richmond is perennially known as also being a disciplined program. Are there places for turnover defensemen to be on that team where they're just kind of being more aggressive, throwing different style checks that cause more turnovers? It's like, well, guess what? We actually rank highest, or we rank pretty high on the turnover side of things too, even though they don't have those traditionally what you call like takeaway defensemen. So
yeah, I mean, this is because there's every year for the pro teams, like I do a defensive report, and one of the things that's on that is like teams that had your same statistical profile. When the ones that got better, what did they do differently? And, in some situations, the answer is you need to go get more turnovers, right? Because you're just sitting back, and your goalie's just getting pelted with shots. And so, there's teams where it's like, yes, you should be more aggressive. There's other teams where you look at it and said the teams that improved, probably didn't force less turnovers, but they were definitely less aggressive, and they allowed fewer shots per possession or something like that. So I think you could end up in a situation where there are some teams that you would say, yes, you should be more aggressive. You need to go create more turnovers because you're just giving up way too many shots on a per possession basis. And other teams where it's like the last thing you want to do is go create more turnovers because that's just going to lead to more goals because your goalie's pretty good on the shots you're allowing. But if you try and get real aggressive and give up a bunch and give up better shots, when you don't get those turnovers, things are going to go downhill. And, teams that were like you who went on to improve did X versus Y is so context specific and so team specific that it's another one where there's no right answer. It's who are you, and given that, what's the right thing for you to try and improve on?
Yeah, this is a great discussion, man. I love that you brought up plus minus too, because I started doing like manually tracking plus minus, especially for my midfielders that don't want to play defense. I'm like, look, your plus minus can't be this low when you're on the field. Like it needs to be at least at this level, whatever that was that I set. But yeah, it was a cool metric because it actually showed the guys I'm bad at defense. If I'm -8 on the game, I'm bad at defense.
It's a great example of a stat that like I can't calculate from my data, but like a coach can calculate pretty easily. And like when you have conversations about playing time, like what is a better metric than that, especially at a level where if all you can do is calculate who was on the field at a given time, and you've got a guy that's like, why am I not on the field? Okay, well, look, I mean, here's why. Here's the exact reason why.
Can I just ask a personal anecdote here? I was doing the plus minus, and if a player's trailing on a play, sometimes I was like, do I give this guy the plus minus, a -1? Because he just got in from the sub box.
Right.
Like he wasn't even on the field, but he's on the field when the play gets scored.
This is why it's so great as a coach to do it, because you can make that decision. I mean, you can have a rule that says that, like, you don't count as on the field until you've passed the farthest offensive player or something like that.
Do you think that that's relevant though? Like, I know it's
well,
okay.
Again, I mean,
okay.
think about you having that conversation. If you went to that kid and you said, "Here's your plus minus," it's -5, and then you think in your head, "Really, it's -4." Well, then you should have it as -4. As long as you're applying the rules consistently, I think whatever's going to make it more relevant to the player and to you is the right way to do it. And so I think in that situation, I would have no problem with treating that as a non on the field player.
Yeah.
I think ultimately you just end up you have to have, as long as it's applied consistently and everybody knows how you're doing it. I think that's totally fine.
What other sports are you pulling from when you're talking about kind of inspiration? I know basketball again is one we talked about up front. Is there any other relevant things you look at from other sports when it comes to data?
I mean, basketball is the big one just because it's such a similar sport in terms of the way offense and defense works. So I think that's for sure one. Now, I mean, from a possession margin perspective, obviously that's very different. And so that's where I think like football is interesting because they do points per drive in some cases, which is kind of similar to the way that we think about offensive efficiency. It's goals per possessions. So I think there's an element of that as well, just because you can potentially have unbalanced possessions. But I mean, I think basketball for sure. But honestly, even some of the stuff from baseball around the way that, well, actually, I guess that was ELO was an NFL one where I first found out about that. So that was more of a football one. So maybe there's no baseball stuff going on, but. Yeah, I mean, it's, I think basketball is 1 and 1A.
Sure.
And I think there's some elements of other sports that fit in there too, but mostly it's basketball.
Okay. Real quick lightning question on this. As far as the women's game is concerned, how much are you working within that sport, and what is the kind of outlook you see for the women's game as it relates to this data set?
I mean, I've got a bunch of women's teams as well. And I think, there's obviously some uniqueness, right, with the free positions and the way that cards work in women's lacrosse. And it's, again, I have these conversations and I'm always learning more about how to apply data in that world differently than in the men's game. But, I do think that it'll be interesting because it feels like the rule changes in women's lacrosse tend to be more impactful in terms of what you see on the field. And obviously, with the men going to the shot clock and the women going to the shot clock, we saw similar patterns in both sports. But the way that they handle cards, especially in transition in the women's game, and some of the strategic tactics around when to take a card, when not to take a card, to slow a transition versus not. That's one that sounds like, from what I've understood, that they've made some rule changes this year that would potentially make it harder to play defense in those situations. I don't know if that's exactly true, but that's one that I think is worth looking out for because they've made several of those types of rule changes in recent years, and they've got shooting space rules and all those sorts of things, which kind of add some uniqueness to the way the women's game is called. And I'll be interested to see. I mean, from the simple one is just see, are we seeing higher goal totals this year because of that? And our teams kind of, now that there's sort of true EMO possessions in women's lacrosse where there wasn't before, or at least in the past, how much is that going to be something that teams focus on? I've never been a huge fan of spending much time on improving your EMO because there's so few situations. But, if women's lacrosse is going to see a lot more man-up situations, maybe it does make sense to do that. So it's something to pay attention to. And then, obviously just, you've got a freshman Tuaratin down in North Carolina. So, the question of whether that's whether anybody's going to be able to knock them off next year will be the question for the 2026 season.
Yeah, for those of you that didn't tune into the first episode I had with Zach in Lax Reference, you brought up the fact that maybe based on the data, and just that's the tough part about data, is that sometimes you look at it in a vacuum when the game is played, obviously in a very gray area. But based on the data, it's like maybe you shouldn't spend that much time coaching man up, man down, even though you have that thought in your head that, oh, we got scored on that EMO when it was a 10-10 game. It's like, well, there were 10 other goals that you let in that maybe you should focus on first. So I love that tidbit.
When I rank the metrics and how correlated they are with winning, the team that has the better EMO efficiency is like a coin flip to win the game. But, there's just so many other things that matter so much more than how you do on EMO. Just it's such a small part of the game. Can be impactful, certainly, but it's, I'd rather have you be a little better at shooting than a little better at EMO.
I love that. Before we hop back into the product quickly to round out the episode, 2026 is quickly upcoming. I think we're going to blink and we're going to be watching the first college game, which you're always excited for, I know. Let's talk on 2026. What are the kind of things you're looking at? You just mentioned that freshman Tuaratin winner from UNC on the women's side, but what things are you looking at other than that?
Yeah, I mean, Claire Humphrey, it's just how do you back that up? And ultimately, a team loses a quarter of their players every year, so it's no guarantee that they'll be as good as they were last year. But yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the UNC story is an interesting one. You've got the big programs. I mean, Navy is a team that I was just always interested in them because they always seem to be around that bubble at the end of the year and looking at as a team that if they had just won a few more games or not had that one letdown, they might have been able to do it. So I think that's always an interesting one. But it's tough because to me the teams it's a brand new season. You've got all new players and players in different roles. And like right now in the newsletter, I'm doing a lot of like, here's a player that had a pretty low usage rate, but a pretty strong season last year. Here's what would have to happen for them to take the next step. And I think those are the interesting stories of the players that, do take that next step. And then, obviously it's always compelling when you've got a team that or team or a player that had a strong year and maybe they fall back to earth. It's funny. I tend not to have a lot of like, here's the players or teams that I'm interested in. But, one thing that I've done a little bit of research on recently is like in football, they talk about one goal or one possession wins and your record and how that's kind of really volatile from year to year. Meaning that if you win, every team is pretty much going to have a 500 record in one possession games in the NFL. And I was curious in lacrosse. I was like, yeah, pretty much the same. I mean, like teams are going to have pretty much a 500 record in one goal games. So I need to go and look at the teams that had really good and really strong records in those situations last year, because those are the ones that you would expect to either have a big bump this year or go down. Because I was thinking, maybe it's not going to be the same on lacrosse. Maybe because of the face-off and the draws, like that. There's something to, if you're up by one, you have a better chance to win. But like no, it's 500 record. If you're so you would expect some of those teams who were really good in those games last year to take a step back, which again goes back to the NPI conversation of like how, maybe that is one area where we can know, hey, you might want to be careful. That team's probably not going to have the same record they had last year because like they went 6-0 in one goal games, and there's no way that's going to happen again. So, it's some of those types of things that I'm curious to see how it plays out this year, and whether the teams that did do really well in those situations last year come back to earth a little bit.
Yeah, that is interesting, because you hear the conversations around teams in the NFL, for example, like maybe they're 2-6, but 5 of those losses came within 1 point or something like that. You're like, why did that happen? And then the human side comes in. It's like, well, how's the leadership? How's the culture? Like deep down, you got to dig in. Maybe that's a leadership thing. So yeah, it's interesting. Maybe those teams in lacrosse that really pull those. It's not
random,
okay.
Random bouncing around of the ball and the coins, and 50-50, man.
Okay, all right. I love that answer.
We humans are very, very quick to put a narrative to a number, but I mean, this, it's like, and who knows? Maybe I'll go back in and be like, there is one team that's consistently better in one goal games, but I think I think we need a lot more years to know that there's actually something there besides just random chance.
Yeah, it's fair. Like I think about one of the greatest players of all time on the NFL side of things, Tom Brady, and people say, "Oh, he's a great leader" and all that stuff. But based on the conversation I'm having with you, it's like, well, just look at his accuracy. Look at how accurate he was with the ball, especially in the moments that mattered.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think this is one of those things too, where like the data works is useful over large samples, and I never want to say like there is no clutch gene. That's not. I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, there are probably going to be players who just from moxie and they are able to do things in certain situations. And now is that just when we look backward and say, wow, that happened a lot of times, they must have a lot of moxie, or is it just they were lucky? I mean, there's part of me I'm a human sports fan, and I love moxie and clutch and that sort of stuff. So like it's one of those things that like you don't necessarily want it to be true, but it's when you look over the large sample, it's hard to argue that for the most part, if you were really good in one goal games, you would expect to have some regression there. Now again, you don't want that to be the case for everybody. So I'll leave it open the possibility that certain teams are clutch.
That would be such a cool stat to see. Is like how lucky a team is. You know what I mean? And maybe you take that win-loss record in those 500 games, because you think about a guy like Eli Manning. Like Eli Manning has 2 Super Bowls. He's not one of the best quarterbacks of all time. Some people even argue whether he can be in the Hall of Fame, but he has those 2 plays in the Super Bowl, the guy catching it on his helmet. What the hell are the chances of that? Yeah, interesting. Let's go into the product a little bit more to finish out. What other things are you looking to develop in 2026 and have done so over the last year, just for people that are interested, just to make this all kind of work and flow a little bit better, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to that. I mentioned kind of that missing middle earlier of like, you've got data, you've got a question. How can I build my interpretation into the system so that you end up with an actual answer as opposed to just some data. I mean, I think it's not necessarily a new feature per se, but I think that's a big part of it, is just trying to figure out better ways to give coaches the insight they need as opposed to the data, right? So that's for sure a big part of it. And then, I do like the idea of like, if you can do that, putting it into the scout, right? Because again, as I've learned more about what coaches really need, like that idea of like, I spend 5 hours a week copying and pasting player stats into a Google Doc so that I can share the scout with my players. Like, that idea of like, I've got a bunch of data, I've got insights, like, is there an avenue to kind of make that process a little bit more efficient? Because ultimately, like, if I can save somebody time copying and pasting or configuring a scout, and they can spend that time watching film or coming up with a practice plan that's going to help them improve in a certain area, like that's a big win. And from the early on, it was like, I have some data. Would you like to see it? If you look at it, you might be able to make better decisions. This is kind of cool to think about. Like, okay, now we can start to get into actually saving some time as well, which would be a cool thing. So that's something to experiment with and see if I can get to the point where they're really starting 80% of the way there, and you're just focusing on film and tactics and strategy as opposed to the busy work behind that goes into some of those things. So will be an interesting thing to play around with this year.
Yeah, Zach, this conversation flew by, man. We're already at an hour. I can't believe it. I usually ask coaches like what your favorite drill is and why, but give me what your favorite 2 stats are and why.
Ooh, let's see.
Let's go top 3. Let's like rank them almost.
All right. Well, I mean, for sure, I think from a box score stat, on goal shooting percentage is my favorite, only because like it just should be such a bigger deal, and it's like crazy to me that we just look at shooting percentage. So like I'll go with on goal shooting percentage as one of my favorites. Let's see, another stat that I really like. I mean, I don't know. Again, I've always come at this mostly from the fan perspective, and like NCAA non-AQ at-large probability is my favorite stat. Like, at a given point in the season, what is the chance that a team will make the NCAA tournament if they don't win their AQ? Like, that isn't. I just think like and maybe it does take up some of the magic out of the sport. I don't know, not for me, but like the idea of knowing that, okay, if this happens, here's where things stand. Like, that to me is just such a fun stat. And so much of what we care about in sports, like who's going to make the tournament, who's going to win the tournament, is kind of encapsulated in that number in some ways. So that's it's not a game stat, but it's definitely one of my favorite ones to work on. And I'm only going to.
It puts way more emphasis. It puts way more emphasis on the games, which I love, as opposed to it being a kind of random game in March. This is basically a playoff game. If you don't win this game,
that's one of the things that I've worked on over the last couple of months. Is like, because I used to say, okay, I simulated the season, and here's every team's non-AQ at-large probability, right? And that's great. But one of the things I didn't do until now is basically collect at a game level and say, okay, how much does this game ripple out? And so like now I've got this model that basically will rank every game of the season based on its ripple effect, meaning like depending on who wins, how much of an impact does it have on every other team's non-AQ at-large probability. And so you can imagine like D1 men's, those games between the Ivies and the ACC early in the year, the Ivies and the Big Ten early in the year, some of those games have huge ripple effects because of the way that they impact conference RPI, and then the fact that like one team played a different team in another league versus that team. So you've got these other teams, kind of like Army situation, Army versus Harvard. But like now I'll actually be able to say, hey, big game today, like this game ripples out. Like there's 5 teams who are not part of this game who have a real stake in who wins. Like I'm very excited to have that, because up until now you sort of have a sense for what those are, but it'll be actually really cool to be able to say, hey, huge Saturday, we've got 4 like huge ripple effect games that are coming, and here's who everybody should be rooting for. Like that's the part that's exciting. If you're a Yale fan, you've got not just your game, but you've got here's the 5 other teams that you should be rooting for, because if they all win, your chances of making the NCAA tournament go up 10 percentage points, which is like a huge effect for a game that you're not even a part of. So like that'll be pretty fun this year, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. You get that with the NFL here at the end of the season. Like I'm a Cowboys fan, we need to win out, but we also need some other things to happen. Yeah, I got that newsletter. It's an awesome newsletter, by the way, that you guys can sign up for. I'll put it in the description. But the Ripple Effect newsletter was pretty cool. You were mentioning Navy is one of those early season games. Is that?
I think it was. I want to say Navy Penn State was one. And again, it's not necessarily that like Navy is going to be an at-large team, but like when you look at a team like Army and a team like maybe Hopkins or Michigan, who are teams that have been on the bubble or near the bubble recently. That game, whether Navy beats Penn State or Penn State beats Navy, has a big effect on all those teams' eventual tournament profiles. So that's one. I mean, like Notre Dame Virginia was actually an interesting one, even though it's in conference, because I think it's just one of those things where like there's teams that are likely to be on the bubble who play Notre Dame. Some of them play Virginia, and so like who wins that game really will have an impact on those bubble teams' resume. That's not one I would have thought of, but yeah, I think Navy Penn State when I last looked was the highest one, and obviously like we don't have all the schedules yet, so these will change. But I'm very excited to be able to sit here and say, here's the 30 biggest games of the year.
Yeah, this is interesting. I'm looking at your newsletter right now, and you classified all games into dust motes, rocks, or boulders, which make different, obviously, ripple effects. And you were saying the biggest boulder is Hopkins Navy,
right.
But the other 6 most impactful are Jacksonville Navy. So Navy just involved in a couple of those. UMass Penn, Brown Lowell, UVA Drexel, UVA Maryland, Notre Dame Michigan.
Yeah, the only problem is that metaphor really broke down, because then I was starting to talk about how like if you could hit ships with boulders and like that is sort of like mixed metaphors. And I got to the end of that, I was like, oh, this didn't make any sense, but I think maybe it worked. I don't know, but yeah. And honestly, like that was pretty early in the year. There weren't a lot of schedules out, and I know like now that even in the last couple of weeks since I put that one out, like there's been quite a few more games. So I'll have to do an update to that article, as we get a little bit more clarity into all the schedules.
Awesome, man. I definitely want to do like a mid-season if we can. I know we did like a preseason last year, preseason this year, and we definitely need to get together like in 2 months to talk about the start of the season. So any last things we didn't touch on that maybe we want to hit on before we end the convo?
78 minutes. I think we touched on most of it. But no, I mean, this is great. I always love talking about this stuff, and it's fun. Like I said, like having the conversations with the coaches is great, because I've come at this from a fan perspective, but being able to hear the questions they have and the things they're struggling with and the things they're trying to answer, really gives me a good sense of like how all this stuff should fit into their day to day, which ultimately is the goal. So, it's fun to talk with you, a coach, and these conversations are always a blast.
Love it. All right, Zach, appreciate it. Guys, you should check out Lax Reference, by the way, if you haven't gotten that throughout the message here on the show. But I appreciate you tuning in. Zach, thanks again, man. We'll have to do this in a couple months.
Like a plan.